then you don't get this self-perpetuating sort of cartel. So, give you an example: BBC. The BBC is a public body. It is funded by public money, which means that you never hear criticism of public spending per se. You will never have heard, ever, the concept from any BBC national TV presenter that we have spent too much money or we spend too much money in the public sector. And you could trawl the records back for the last 50 years. You simply won't find it because they are beneficiaries of public spending largesse.
Absolutely not at all, any of them. I am the only radical on the committee. I also fancy myself as, after 40 years working in the City of London and investment management, rather knowing more about it than anybody else on the committee, if you'll forgive my arrogance. If I may go back to Mr. Lambert's analogy on an aeroplane, I think it was you, sir, when I thought it was a good one. I regard banking regulation of this nature, any form of regulation, of this nature, of being an aeroplane indeed, but a concrete aeroplane. So the reason I don't turn up to committees to waste my life, of which there may not be much left, I don't know, I certainly don't intend to waste my life trying to help redraw a concrete aeroplane by moving the engines about, moving the seats about, arguing that we should have a different pilot. It is doomed to failure. We have learnt nothing from the latest crisis, I fear. We will have another banking crisis. We are bound to. It breaks a number of fundamental economic laws, of which there are few. First of all, the law of fatal conceit. The law of fatal conceit, which means that this committee feels it knows enough about banking, international banking, to regulate it, which of course is an absurdity. It means to regulate it, we would also need perfect knowledge of the market. Perfect knowledge of the market is an absurdity. How could we possibly have that in a fast-moving financial service world? We talk about retail banks, and we like to put the boot into real retail banks because we're politicians. But of course the real fault lies with central banks, not retail banks. It isn't banking bonuses that make bankers take lunatic risks. It's the knowledge that politicians will use taxpayers' money to pick up the pieces. This is your problem, not bonuses. This is why bankers act in the manner that they do. They're in a no-lose situation. They can only win. One year they get a monster bonus, the next year the bank goes bust. Doesn't matter, they don't go to pokey. Most of the rules here are broken, should be governed by common law or statute law, not regulation. If you, and I made the point in a speech this afternoon, in the United States in 1850, if you carried out the fractional reserve banking system, i.e. you lent money that you didn't have, you would not just go to prison, you would hang. It was a criminal offence, it was a capital offence. I'd like to see that come back. We talk about LIBOR, we talk about interest rate manipulation. Well, who manipulates interest rates? It's the central banks. The central banks manipulate interest rates, and that's by buying fake junk bonds and counterfeiting money, which they call quantitative easing. And again, as I made the point this afternoon, if any of you in this audience tried that, you would go straight to prison. It's counterfeit, but we call it quantitative easing. So this is largely a problem of politics, not of banking. So this is what we really need to be dealing with. We need to be cutting away the whole banking system and starting again. We need custody banking on the one hand, so if you go and put your money into a bank, it's a custody bank, they don't lend the money on, they keep 100% of it. And so if you all knock on the door of that bank again, your money is all still there. Under fractional reserve banking, even under Basel III, even if it was 10% or even if it was 15%, you know that only 15% of your money would be there. What kind of absurd system is this? What kind of crazy, maniacal system is it, fractional reserve banking, that you know your money isn't going to be there? Now, if you want an interest coupon, you invest your money in a bank and they say to you, how long will you give it to us for? And you say 5 years. In which case they say, we will give you an interest rate coupon, we'll pay you 5%. But don't come back in under 5 years, because it won't be there, because we'll have lent it on. It's a risk assessment. You make an individual risk assessment as an individual when you lend that money. And if you're elderly and you don't want to risk money, you just want to maintain wealth, you put it in a custody bank. None of my committee members ever talk about anything practical or sensible like this, which is why I don't turn up to committee meetings. I'd sooner go to the cocktail bar. It's more fruitful.
EFD, for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Godfrey Bloom.
President, Commissioner, not for the first time I rise to give you the benefit of my 35 years' experience in financial services, I suspect rather more than the rest of you put together. Let me put you right on how this all started. It started with something called the Community Reinvestment Act in America. And the reason the whole thing has gone wrong is because political interference. And we've been talking today, haven't we, about due diligence. Due diligence in banking. Well, the Community Reinvestment Act actually stopped banks carrying out due diligence. It was illegal to actually inquire of a borrower whether he could or could not repay the loan. And that's when you saw the invention of subprime mortgages, which never existed before. So it was political interference in the market which caused the subprime crisis. And if you add to that the bubble in the property market was created by criminal fraudulent central bankers printing money and artificially restraining interest rates, as central banks are still doing now. The Fed is still doing it, the ECB, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, they're all at it, counterfeiting money. So we're lending money now at a far too cheap a rate, and we just print more money, and we're going to have another bubble, and we're going to do the whole thing all over again. And may I just close with just one thing, because something you don't understand clearly. If you can't foreclose on a mortgage, nobody will give you a mortgage. That's how the market works. Leave it to the market, caveat emptor, and let people get on with it without interference from politicians who, frankly, do not know what they are talking about. Thank you, Mr. President. I wonder if you'll permit me to gallop through the working day of the average Englishman. He wakes up and he turns on his taxed telly to get the news. He leaves his heavily taxed house, gets in his heavily taxed car, he fills it with heavily taxed diesel, he gets to work to earn an income which, after income tax, employer and employee national insurance, a third of his income has disappeared. A third. He drives home and stops on the high street for a few articles for the house. His purchases are taxed at 20%. He calls in for a pint, over 2/3 of the cost of which goes in tax. He dreams of a family holiday abroad, but he can't afford the airport tax. He longs for the day that he can retire, but the politicians won't let him go. We must steal his savings, mustn't we? The financial transaction tax. The poor sap doesn't even know we've nicked it. Of course, with the Commission, top salaries income tax free, non-contributory pension schemes, it's difficult for you, isn't it, to imagine his distress? Because you're not in this game, are you? You're not in this game. You don't pay any of this. You don't pay any of this.
You. I can still, on a good session at Pocklington Rugby Club, manage an 8-pint session without being carried out by interns.
Have you attempted a Hague-a-thon in honour of William Hague drinking, I think it's 12 or 14 pints in?
14 is beyond my measure these days, although when I was playing rugger at 22, 23, I think I would expect 12 to 14 pints, otherwise I wouldn't have had a decent evening. But now 8 pints, and should anybody not believe me, if they want to come to Pocklington Rugby Club and pay for them, I'll show beyond any doubt that I can drink them.
Godfrey Bloom, thank you for joining us. Really
Great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Cheers. How hard did you hit Michael Crick with that legit conference brochure, by the way? It looked brutal.
Well, I used to box lightweight in the army, and I can tell you, if you think that's brutal, when I was your age, he'd still be in hospital.